The morning Rebecca Martinez decided to surprise her husband with his favorite homemade blueberry muffins, she never expected to find her own wedding ring hidden in his desk drawer. But that discovery was just the beginning of unraveling a web of lies that would change everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca had always been the type of wife who believed in small gestures. After 3 years of marriage to David Chen, she still felt butterflies when she thought about surprising him with little acts of love. That Tuesday morning in October, she'd woken up with the sudden urge to bake his favorite blueberry muffins and deliver them to his downtown law office before his important client meeting at 10. The autumn air was crisp as she drove through the familiar streets of Portland, the container of warm muffins filling her car with their sweet aroma. David had been working incredibly long hours lately, often staying at the office until well past midnight, and she wanted to remind him that she appreciated his dedication to building their future together. Their small apartment might not be much, but they were saving for a house, planning for children, building something beautiful together. At least, that's what she had believed until she walked into Chen and Associates at 9:15 that morning. The law firm occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming downtown building, and Rebecca had visited dozens of times over the years. She knew the receptionist, Martha, and had chatted with several of David's colleagues at office parties and firm events. She'd always felt proud walking through those polished corridors, knowing she was married to one of their most promising young attorneys. But this morning felt different from the moment she stepped off the elevator. Martha looked genuinely surprised to see her, which was unusual since Rebecca had visited unannounced before. There was something almost uncomfortable in the older woman's expression, a fleeting look of confusion that she quickly tried to mask with a professional smile. "Rebecca, what a surprise! David didn't mention you were coming by today." "I wanted to surprise him with muffins before his big meeting," Rebecca replied, lifting the container. "Is he in his office?" "He's actually in the conference room with Mr. Harrison, going over some documents. But I'm sure he'll be free in a few minutes." Rebecca had planned to wait in David's office, as she'd done countless times before. She knew he wouldn't mind, and she enjoyed looking at the framed photos of their wedding day that he kept on his desk. The one of them dancing at their reception always made her smile, remembering how nervous he'd been about his speech, but how perfectly everything had turned out. "I'll just wait in his office," she said, heading down the familiar hallway. "Oh, actually," Martha called after her, her voice carrying a strange urgency, "maybe you should wait out here. He really doesn't like anyone in his office when he's not there. You know how particular he is about his files." The comment struck Rebecca as odd. David had never been particular about his office space, and she'd waited there before without any issues. But she didn't want to cause problems, so she returned to the reception area and settled into one of the leather chairs with a magazine. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The muffins were getting cold, and Rebecca was beginning to worry about the timing. David's meeting was supposed to start at 10, and she didn't want to make him late. She checked her phone, but he hadn't responded to her text letting him know she was there. "I think I'll just pop into his office and leave these with a note. That way, he'll find them when he gets back." Before Martha could protest again, Rebecca was already walking down the hallway. Something about the receptionist's behavior was bothering her, though she couldn't quite articulate what felt wrong. It was as if Martha was trying to protect her from something, or perhaps protect David from her unexpected visit. David's office door was unlocked, as it usually was during business hours. The familiar space greeted her with its neat bookshelves, diplomas on the walls, and the large mahogany desk that had been a gift from his parents when he graduated law school. But as she approached the desk to leave the muffins, she noticed something that made her heart skip. The framed photos of their wedding were gone, not just moved or turned around, but completely absent from their usual spot beside his computer monitor. The space where they'd always sat was now occupied by a small stack of legal documents and a coffee mug she didn't recognize. She looked around the office more carefully, searching for the photos, thinking perhaps he'd relocated them during some reorganization. They were nowhere to be seen. A cold feeling began to settle in her stomach as she processed this discovery. Why would David remove their wedding photos from his office? They'd been there just 2 weeks ago when she'd stopped by to bring him lunch. I distinctly remember straightening the frame of their dancing photo because it had been slightly crooked. Trying to rationalize the situation, she told herself there could be innocent explanations. Maybe he'd taken them home to have new ones printed. Maybe he'd moved them to make room for important client files. Maybe they were in his desk drawer for safekeeping. Acting on this thought, she gently pulled open the top drawer of his desk, expecting to find the familiar silver frames tucked safely inside. Instead, she found something that made her blood run cold. Her wedding ring. Not just any wedding ring, but specifically the one that had gone missing from their bathroom counter 3 weeks ago. She'd searched everywhere for it, even hired a professional cleaning service to deep clean their apartment in case it had fallen into some impossible crevice. David had been so understanding about the loss, even offering to buy her a replacement, though they'd decided to wait until they found the original since it held such sentimental value. But here it was, nestled in his desk drawer, alongside some business cards and paper clips, as if it were just another office supply. Rebecca's hands trembled as she picked up the ring, the familiar weight of it confirming what her eyes couldn't quite accept. This was definitely her ring, the one with the tiny inscription on the inside band that read, "Forever yours, D," in David's careful handwriting. The same ring she'd worn every day for 3 years, until it mysteriously disappeared from their bathroom. Why was her wedding ring in David's office desk drawer? The questions multiplied faster than she could process them. Had David found the ring and forgotten to tell her? That seemed impossible, given how upset she'd been about losing it and how thoroughly they'd searched together. Had he taken it for some reason and then forgotten where he'd put it? That also seemed unlikely, considering how organized and methodical he was about everything. Or was there a more sinister explanation? She continued searching through the drawer, her movements becoming more frantic as her mind raced through possibilities. Beneath a stack of business cards, she found something that made her sit down heavily in David's chair. A second business card holder, one she'd never seen before, filled with cards that bore David's name and contact information. But these weren't the standard Shen and Associates cards she was familiar with. These cards listed only his personal cell phone number and email address, with no mention of the law firm. More disturbing was what they didn't mention, any indication that he was married. The cards were elegant, expensive-looking, with his name in raised lettering. They looked professional and deliberately crafted, not like something he'd had made for a specific purpose or project. These were the kind of cards someone carried when they wanted to present themselves as single and available. Rebecca's heart was pounding as she examined the cards more closely. The phone number was correct, as was the email address, but everything else about them suggested a man living a completely different life. A single man with no obligations, no wife waiting at home, no shared dreams or future plans. She opened the other desk drawers with growing desperation, each discovery adding another piece to a puzzle she didn't want to solve. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath some legal files, she found a small leather notebook, the kind David sometimes used for taking notes during client meetings. But this one was different. This one was personal. The entries were written in David's familiar handwriting, but they chronicled activities and events she knew nothing about. Dinner reservations at expensive restaurants she'd never been to, weekend plans that didn't include her, names of women she'd never heard mentioned with phone numbers and what appeared to be notes about their conversations. One entry from just 2 weeks ago made her feel physically sick. Drinks with Amanda, 8 p.m. at the Pearl. Told her about the promotion possibility. She seemed impressed. Good chemistry. Rebecca remembered that evening clearly. David had told her he was working late on a difficult case and wouldn't be home until after midnight. She'd fallen asleep watching a movie, waiting for him to return. When he'd finally come home, he'd kissed her forehead and whispered that the case was going well but required more late nights in the coming weeks. He'd been on a date while she'd been at home in her pajamas, worried about him working too hard and planning to make his favorite breakfast the next morning. He'd been at an upscale bar with another woman pretending to be single. The notebook contained months of similar entries: coffee dates, lunch meetings that clearly weren't business related, evening events at places she'd never heard of with people whose names were foreign to her. Each entry was like a glimpse into a parallel life David was living, one that existed completely separate from their marriage. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Tucked behind the notebook was a small stack of photographs, printed on expensive photo paper, the kind of professional quality prints that suggested they were meaningful enough to invest in proper printing rather than just keeping them on a phone. The photos showed David at various social events, office parties, and casual gatherings. In every single image, he was surrounded by colleagues and friends she recognized from firm events. But in these photos, he was clearly presenting himself as single. His body language, his positioning in group shots, his interactions with women, everything about his demeanor suggested a man who was available and unattached. One photo from what appeared to be a recent firm holiday party showed David with his arm casually draped around a beautiful Asian woman in a red dress. Rebecca remembered this party because David had told her it was a small, boring affair that wouldn't be worth her time to attend. He said it was just a few senior partners and their spouses, mostly older people discussing business over dinner. But this photo showed a large, festive gathering with dozens of people, live music, and elaborate decorations. The woman in the red dress was young, probably in her late 20s, and she was looking at David with obvious affection while he smiled at the camera with the confident expression of a man enjoying the attention. Rebecca had been home that night, as she had been for countless other events David had downplayed or simply not mentioned. She thought he was being considerate, not wanting to drag her to boring work functions. Now she realized he'd been systematically excluding her from his professional life, creating opportunities to socialize as a single man.
Instead, he'd been protecting his ability to live a double life. The office door opened behind her, and Rebecca quickly closed the drawer, her heart hammering as she tried to look casual while sitting in David's chair, with evidence of his deception scattered around her. "Rebecca?" David's voice carried surprise and something that might have been alarm. "What are you doing here?" She turned to face her husband, the man she'd been married to for 3 years, the man she'd thought she knew completely. He looked exactly the same as always, professionally dressed in his navy suit, his hair perfectly styled, his expression showing what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing her unexpectedly. But now she was looking at him through the lens of everything she just discovered, and she realized she was seeing a stranger. "I brought you muffins," she said, her voice sounding remarkably steady, despite the chaos in her mind, "for your big meeting." David's eyes flickered to the container on his desk, then back to her face, scanning her expression as if trying to determine how much she might have seen or discovered. The pause lasted just a moment too long, confirming her growing suspicion that he was calculating how to respond. "That's so sweet of you," he said, moving to kiss her cheek in his usual greeting. "But you know you don't need to come all the way downtown just for that. I could have grabbed something from the cafe downstairs." "I wanted to do something special for you," she replied, watching his face carefully. "You've been working so hard lately, staying so late at the office. I thought you deserved a treat." Something flickered in his expression at the mention of his late hours, a micro-expression that suggested discomfort with the topic. Before discovering the contents of his desk, she might have interpreted it as fatigue or stress about his heavy workload. Now she wondered what he was really thinking about during those supposed late nights at the office. "The meeting's about to start," David said, glancing at his watch. "Why don't I walk you back to the reception area? You can say goodbye to Martha before you head home." His eagerness to get her out of his office was subtle but unmistakable. He was standing near the door in a way that suggested he expected her to follow him immediately,
and his body language conveyed a gentle but firm pressure for her to leave. Rebecca stood up slowly, her mind racing as she tried to decide how to handle this moment. Should she confront him immediately about what she'd found? Should she pretend everything was normal while she gathered more information? Should she demand an explanation for why her wedding ring was hidden in his desk drawer? The smart part of her brain, the part that had always served her well in difficult situations, whispered that she needed more information before making any accusations. The evidence she'd found was damning, but she needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before deciding how to respond. "I'll get out of your way," she said, moving toward the door. "Good luck with your meeting." But as they walked back toward the reception area, Rebecca's mind was cataloging every detail of David's behavior, every micro-expression and verbal choice that might provide additional clues about the life he was apparently living without her knowledge. Martha looked relieved to see them approaching together, which struck Rebecca as another odd detail in a morning full of strange observations. Why would the receptionist be relieved unless she'd been worried about Rebecca discovering something she shouldn't? "I'll see you at home tonight," David said, kissing her goodbye with what appeared to be his usual affection. "Thank you for the muffins. You're amazing." The words that should have felt loving and familiar now sounded hollow, like lines he was reciting for an audience. Rebecca found herself wondering if anything about their relationship was genuine, or if she'd been living in an elaborate performance designed to give David the stability of marriage while preserving his freedom to pursue other relationships. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt interminable, each floor giving her more time to process what she'd discovered and consider what it might mean. By the time she reached her car, Rebecca had made a decision that would have seemed impossible when she'd pulled into the parking garage that morning. She was going to investigate further, not because she enjoyed suspicion or wanted to destroy her marriage, but because she owed it to herself to understand the truth about the life she was living. If David was presenting himself as single to his colleagues and maintaining relationships with other women, she needed to know the full extent of his deception before deciding how to respond. The drive home took 25 minutes, but Rebecca's mind was already hours ahead, planning how she could learn more about the double life she'd accidentally uncovered. She thought about the names in David's notebook, the photos that suggested extensive social activities she'd never heard about, the business cards that painted him as an available bachelor. Most importantly, she thought about her wedding ring sitting in his desk drawer, like a dirty secret, hidden away as if their marriage was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. For 3 years, she'd believed she was building a life with someone who loved and valued her. She'd made countless sacrifices and compromises, always with the understanding that they were partners working toward shared goals. She'd turned down job opportunities that would have required relocation, postponed graduate school plans, even declined social invitations when David said he preferred quiet evenings at home. Now she wondered if all those choices had been made based on lies. As she pulled into the parking space outside their apartment building, Rebecca caught herself in the rearview mirror again. This time, instead of seeing a woman who looked the same despite having her world turned upside down, she saw someone who was finally ready to stop being naive. The apartment felt different when she walked inside, as if the familiar spaces had been contaminated by her new knowledge. The wedding photos David had apparently removed from his office were prominently displayed throughout their home, creating a strange contrast with his professional presentation of himself as single. Were these photos just props now, maintaining the illusion of domestic happiness while he pursued his real interests elsewhere? She walked through their bedroom, examining David's belongings with new eyes. His clothes, his personal effects, his side of the bathroom counter. Everything looked normal and innocent. But then again, she realized she'd probably been looking at all of this with trusting eyes for years, never questioning whether the man she went to sleep beside each night was the same man who went to work each morning. She sat on their bed, still unmade from that morning's rush to get ready, and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just about David being friendly with female colleagues or failing to mention her at work social events. This was systematic deception, a carefully maintained alternate identity that allowed him to pursue relationships while keeping the security and comfort of marriage.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The question now was what she was going to do about it. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment she considered not answering. But curiosity won, and she picked up on the third ring. "Hey." His voice sounded normal, affectionate even. "I just wanted to thank you again for the muffins. They were perfect before the meeting." "How did it go?" she asked, trying to match his casual tone while studying every word for hidden meanings. "Really well. I think we're going to land this client, which could mean big things for my career trajectory here." The phrase career trajectory struck her as odd. David had always discussed his professional goals in terms of their shared future, talking about how success at the firm would help them buy a house, start a family, build the life they'd planned together. This phrasing made it sound like a purely individual pursuit. "That's wonderful," she said. "Will this mean more travel or longer hours?" There was a pause before he responded, and she found herself analyzing the silence for meaning. "Probably some additional responsibilities, but nothing too dramatic. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering what to expect. You've already been working such long hours lately." "It's temporary," David said quickly, "just until we get through this busy period. Things should calm down after the holidays." The holidays were still 2 months away, Rebecca realized. How long had he been using busy periods and temporary situations to explain away his absences? Looking back, she couldn't remember a time in recent memory when he hadn't been in the middle of some professional crisis that required him to spend excessive time away from home. "I'll let you get back to work," she said. "Love you. Love you too," he replied. And she hung up wondering if those words had ever been genuine or if they were just part of the script he'd been following for the past 3 years. The rest of the afternoon stretched ahead of her with a strange sense of possibility. For the first time in months, she had no plans, no obligations, and no illusions about her marriage to maintain. Instead, she had a mystery to solve, and the uncomfortable but liberating knowledge that nothing was as it seemed. Rebecca made herself a cup of coffee and sat at their kitchen table with a notepad, beginning to compile everything she knew and everything she needed to find out. The methodical approach helped calm her racing thoughts and gave her a sense of control over a situation that threatened to spiral into chaos. What she knew: David had removed their wedding photos from his office, hidden her wedding ring in his desk drawer, carried business cards that presented him as single, maintained a notebook documenting social activities she'd never heard about, and possessed photos showing him at events he'd either not mentioned or actively discouraged her from attending. What she needed to find out: how long this had been going on, how many people in his professional life knew he was married, whether his relationships with other women had progressed beyond social interaction, and, most importantly, whether there was any part of their marriage that was genuine, or if the entire relationship had become an elaborate deception. As the afternoon light faded outside their apartment windows, Rebecca felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her. This morning, she'd been a trusting wife who believed in the fundamental honesty of her marriage. Tonight, she would begin the process of discovering who her husband really was and what her life had actually become. The woman who had driven downtown to deliver homemade muffins no longer existed. In her place sat someone harder, more skeptical, and infinitely more determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might prove to be. The game had changed, and Rebecca was finally ready to learn the rules. Rebecca spent the next 3 days operating like a detective in her own life. Every conversation with David became an opportunity to gather intelligence. Every late meeting he mentioned got cross-referenced with the social media accounts she'd started monitoring. Every business trip or evening commitment was now subject to verification through methods she'd never imagined using in her marriage. The transformation felt both empowering and heartbreaking. 3 years of trusting blindly had ended, replaced by a methodical approach to uncovering the truth about the man she'd shared a bed with for over 1,000 nights. The naive wife who had baked muffins on Tuesday morning was gone, evolved into someone who understood that love without verification was just wishful thinking.
Her first breakthrough came on Friday evening when David announced he'd be attending a client dinner that would run late. He kissed her goodbye at 6:30, mentioning that the restaurant was upscale and the clients were important potential partners for the firm. Rebecca waited exactly 45 minutes before implementing the plan she'd been developing all week. The law firm's website had a social events page that she'd never paid attention to before, but now she checked it religiously. Tonight's listing showed a networking mixer at the Metropolitan Grill, the same upscale restaurant David had mentioned. But this wasn't a client dinner. This was a singles event for young professionals, specifically marketed as an opportunity to expand your network and meet like-minded individuals in a relaxed social setting. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read the event description. David hadn't just lied about the nature of the evening, he'd deliberately chosen an event designed for unmarried professionals looking to connect personally and professionally. The registration page even included a note about the dress code being cocktail attire for making lasting impressions. She remembered how carefully David had chosen his outfit that evening, trying on 3 different ties before settling on the one that made his eyes look particularly striking. At the time, she thought he was just being professional. Now, she realized he'd been preparing for a performance. The Metropolitan Grill was only 20 minutes from their apartment, close enough for Rebecca to drive there and confirm her suspicions. She'd never followed him before, never felt the need to verify his whereabouts, but the woman she had become this week was capable of things the old Rebecca would have found unthinkable. She dressed carefully, in dark jeans and a black sweater, clothes that would help her blend into shadows if necessary. The entire exercise felt surreal, like she was preparing for a role in some twisted romantic thriller rather than investigating her own husband's potential infidelity.
The restaurant's exterior buzzed with activity when she arrived. Well-dressed men and women in their 20s and 30s streamed through the entrance, many carrying the confident energy of people expecting to meet someone special. Rebecca parked across the street where she could observe the entrance while remaining invisible. At 8:15, she spotted David emerging from a taxi, looking handsome and relaxed in his charcoal suit. But he wasn't alone. The woman walking beside him was tall and elegant, with blonde hair styled in an elaborate updo, and a red dress that suggested she'd put considerable effort into her appearance. More concerning was their body language, the easy familiarity between them that spoke of previous encounters. Rebecca watched as David placed his hand on the small of the woman's back while guiding her toward the restaurant entrance. The gesture was subtle but unmistakably intimate, the kind of touch reserved for someone you're romantically involved with rather than a casual acquaintance. They paused at the entrance, and Rebecca could see David saying something that made the woman laugh, her face tilting up toward his with obvious affection. The scene unfolding across the street was everything Rebecca had feared and more. This wasn't a business dinner or even a case of David being friendly with female colleagues. This was a date, complete with coordinated arrival, intimate touches, and the kind of chemistry that only develops between 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other. Rebecca sat in her car for another hour, documenting everyone she recognized entering and leaving the restaurant. Several of David's colleagues from the firm attended, all presenting themselves as single and available. She photographed license plates, noted arrival times, and began building a comprehensive picture of David's alternate social circle. The most damaging revelation came when she spotted Martha, the firm's receptionist, arriving with her husband. Rebecca had always liked Martha, finding her warm and grandmotherly during her visits to David's office. But seeing her at this singles event meant she was complicit in David's deception, actively helping him maintain his facade of availability. When Martha had seemed uncomfortable about Rebecca visiting David's office, it hadn't been protectiveness toward office protocol. It had been the awkwardness of someone who knew David was living a double life and didn't want to be caught in the middle when his wife discovered the truth. Rebecca drove home with a burning clarity about the extent of David's betrayal. This wasn't a recent development or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a systematic deception involving multiple people from his professional life, all of whom apparently knew he was married but were willing to participate in his charade of being single. David returned home just after midnight, his explanation matching what she'd observed. The client dinner had gone well, the potential partners were interested in working with the firm, and the evening had been productive for his career advancement.
Every word was technically truthful while being fundamentally dishonest, a masterclass in deception that made Rebecca wonder how many other conversations over the past 3 years had been similarly constructed. She pretended to be asleep when he slipped into bed beside her, though sleep was impossible with her mind racing through everything she'd learned. The man lying next to her had spent the evening on what was essentially a date with another woman, then returned home to his wife as if nothing had happened. The casual nature of his deception was almost more disturbing than the deception itself. Saturday morning brought new opportunities for investigation. David announced he'd be playing golf with colleagues, a monthly tradition that Rebecca had never questioned. But her newfound skepticism prompted her to dig deeper into this apparently innocent activity. The golf course David claimed to frequent had no record of his membership or any scheduled tournaments for that weekend. A quick call to the pro shop, disguised as a wife trying to surprise her husband with a gift certificate, revealed that David Chen was not a regular player at their facility. In fact, they had no record of anyone by that name ever using their services. Rebecca spent Saturday conducting surveillance that would have impressed a private investigator. She followed David's car from their apartment to an upscale shopping district where he met the same blonde woman from the previous night. They spent the afternoon browsing boutiques together, sharing lunch at a cafe where their body language suggested increasing intimacy. The casual nature of their interaction was perhaps the most telling detail. These weren't two people getting to know each other. This was a couple comfortable with each other's company, familiar with each other's preferences, operating with the easy rhythm of an established relationship. When the woman tried on a necklace at a jewelry store, David's opinion clearly mattered to her. When they shared dessert at lunch, the gesture felt natural and practiced. Rebecca documented everything from her position across the street, using her phone's camera to capture images that would serve as evidence when the time came for confrontation. Each photo felt like collecting ammunition for a war she'd never wanted to fight, but one that had apparently been declared against her without her knowledge. The most devastating moment came when she watched David purchase the necklace the woman had admired. The transaction took place at an expensive jewelry store, and Rebecca could see through the window as David handed over what appeared to be a credit card for the purchase. He then fastened the necklace around the woman's neck, his fingers lingering at her nape in a gesture so intimate that Rebecca had to look away. David was buying jewelry for another woman, using money from their joint account, funds Rebecca had contributed to through her own job at the marketing agency. Money they'd been saving for their future home was being spent on gifts for his girlfriend, a betrayal so fundamental that it challenged everything Rebecca thought she understood about their relationship. The drive home required every ounce of self-control Rebecca possessed. She wanted to confront David immediately, to demand explanations and accountability for his behavior. But the strategic part of her mind, the part that had been developing over the past week, recognized that premature confrontation would only give him opportunities to cover his tracks and develop better lies. Instead, she spent Saturday evening researching divorce attorneys while David showered off what he claimed was an afternoon of golf. The irony was perfect. While he was washing away evidence of his real activities, she was gathering the information she'd need to legally separate her life from his. Sunday provided the breakthrough she'd been hoping for. David announced he'd be spending the day at the office, catching up on paperwork and preparing for the upcoming week. But Rebecca's investigation had revealed a pattern. David's supposed work commitments often coincided with social events she could track through various professional networking websites. A deeper dive into the law firm's social media presence revealed that several attorneys, including David, were participating in a charity 5K run that morning, followed by a brunch fundraiser. The event was organized by the Young Professionals Association, the same group that had sponsored Friday night's networking mixer. Rebecca had never been a runner, but she owned athletic clothes and could certainly manage to be in the vicinity of a public charity event. She arrived at the starting line early, positioning herself where she could observe without being noticed. The crowd was substantial, with hundreds of participants wearing matching t-shirts and carrying racing numbers. David appeared with his now familiar blonde companion, both wearing professional running gear that suggested they've participated in similar events together before. They moved through their pre-race routine with the synchronized efficiency of a couple accustomed to shared activities, stretching together, adjusting each other's racing numbers, sharing water from the same bottle, all while maintaining physical contact that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Rebecca positioned herself along the race route, documenting David's performance not as an athletic achievement, but as evidence of his systematic deception.
Every smile he shared with his companion, every encouraging touch during the race, every moment of celebration at the finish line was proof that he was living a complete parallel life that had nothing to do with his marriage. The post-race brunch was even more revealing. Rebecca watched from the adjacent coffee shop as David and his companion joined a table of other young professionals, all clearly comfortable with each other's company. The group dynamic suggested these were people who socialized regularly, who knew each other's stories and shared inside jokes. David's behavior at the table was particularly damning. He sat close to the blonde woman, his arm casually draped over the back of her chair in a possessive gesture that spoke of established intimacy. When other men at the table interacted with her, David's body language became subtly protective, marking his territory in ways that only occurred in romantic relationships. But the most shocking revelation came when Rebecca overheard fragments of conversation through the coffee shop's open windows. David was discussing vacation plans with the group, describing an upcoming trip to Napa Valley that he was apparently taking with his companion. Rebecca had never heard anything about wine country plans, and their shared calendar showed no vacation time blocked out for the next several months. David was planning getaways with another woman, using vacation time Rebecca thought they were saving for their delayed honeymoon. The trip they'd been postponing for financial reasons was apparently happening, just not with his wife. Rebecca spent the remainder of Sunday conducting online research that revealed the full scope of David's alternate identity. Social media accounts she'd never known existed showed him attending dozens of events over the past year, always with the same companion, always presenting himself as single and available. Professional networking sites listed him as unmarried, and his LinkedIn profile contained no mention of Rebecca or their shared life. The digital evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. David had created an entire online presence that erased her existence from his life. Every platform, every account, every professional and social connection pointed to a man who was not only single, but actively seeking romantic connections with other women. Monday morning brought a new challenge, maintaining normalcy while planning her next moves. David's behavior at breakfast was perfectly normal, affectionate even, as he discussed his upcoming week and asked about her own plans. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This man who kissed her goodbye and told her he loved her was the same person who'd spent the weekend on a romantic date with another woman. Rebecca had reached a decision point that felt both terrifying and liberating. She could no longer pretend ignorance about David's double life, but she also couldn't confront him without a comprehensive strategy. The evidence she'd gathered was substantial, but she needed to ensure that any confrontation would result in truth rather than more elaborate lies. Her first step was financial. That afternoon, Rebecca visited their bank and discovered transactions she'd never noticed before. Regular payments to restaurants she'd never been to, charges at hotels during times when David claimed to be working late, purchases at stores she didn't recognize. The pattern of deception extended far beyond social events into every aspect of their shared financial life. Most damaging was a series of charges to travel websites, confirming that David had indeed booked the Napa Valley trip she'd overheard him discussing. The reservation was for 2 people, with accommodations at a romantic bed and breakfast that specialized in couples retreats. The total cost was nearly $3,000, money that had come from their joint savings account without Rebecca's knowledge or consent. Rebecca requested detailed statements going back 18 months, revealing a pattern of financial deception that predated many of the social events she'd discovered. David had been systematically using their shared resources to fund his relationship with another woman, treating their marriage like a convenient source of financial stability while pursuing his real romantic interests elsewhere. The bank statements also revealed something that made Rebecca's hands shake with rage. David had opened a separate checking account 6 months earlier, one that Rebecca's name wasn't on. Regular transfers from their joint account had been funding this secret account, which was then used for purchases Rebecca never saw on their shared statements. He'd been stealing from their marriage to finance his affair.
That evening, Rebecca made another discovery that crystallized her understanding of David's character. While he was in the shower, she examined his laptop more carefully than she'd ever done before. His email contained correspondence with his companion that detailed their relationship in explicit terms. The messages weren't just romantic, they were actively contemptuous of Rebecca and their marriage. David had described his wife as convenient but boring, someone who provided domestic stability while he pursued more exciting connections. His companion had responded with encouragement, even suggesting ways David could minimize time spent at home without arousing suspicion. One particularly cruel exchange from 3 weeks earlier showed David complaining about Rebecca's desire to start trying for children. He described her maternal instincts as clingy and desperate, telling his girlfriend that he had no intention of having children with someone he planned to leave eventually. The woman had responded with relief, saying she was glad he wasn't trapped in a situation that would complicate their future together. Rebecca sat in their bedroom, reading emails that detailed plans for her husband to abandon her after using her for financial and domestic convenience. The casual cruelty of their communications was breathtaking. These weren't two people who had fallen in love despite difficult circumstances. These were individuals who viewed Rebecca's feelings and future as completely irrelevant to their own happiness. The emails also revealed that David's companion, whose name was apparently Victoria, worked at a competing law firm. Their relationship had begun as a professional connection at a legal conference, evolved into a friendship, and ultimately became a full romantic partnership that both participants expected to replace David's marriage. Victoria's messages showed she was fully aware that David was married, but considered Rebecca an obstacle to be overcome rather than a person deserving of honesty or respect. She'd encouraged David to maintain the facade of his marriage while building their relationship, viewing his deception as evidence of his commitment to their future together rather than a character flaw that might eventually affect her as well. Tuesday brought Rebecca's most ambitious surveillance operation yet. David had mentioned a business trip to Seattle, a client meeting that would require him to be out of town for 2 nights. But Rebecca's research had revealed that no attorneys from David's firm were listed at any Seattle conferences or meetings that week. Rebecca booked herself on the same flight David had taken, using miles from her personal credit card to secure a seat several rows behind him. She watched as he boarded the plane alone, apparently unaccompanied by any business colleagues who might legitimately require his presence in Seattle. The flight provided an opportunity to observe David's behavior when he thought he was completely unobserved. He spent the journey texting enthusiastically, his face showing the kind of excitement and anticipation that Rebecca remembered from their early relationship. Occasionally, he would smile at his phone in ways that suggested intimate conversation with someone who made him genuinely happy. Rebecca felt a stab of recognition and loss. David had once looked that way when texting with her, back when their relationship was new and every communication felt significant. Now, those expressions of joy and anticipation were directed toward another one, while Rebecca received perfunctory communications about flight delays and meeting schedules. The Seattle airport revealed the next piece of David's deception. Instead of heading toward ground transportation that would take him to a downtown business district, David walked directly to the arrivals area, where Victoria was waiting for him.
Their reunion was passionate and unguarded, the kind of greeting reserved for lovers who'd been separated by distance and were eager to reconnect. Rebecca followed them at a discreet distance as they collected David's luggage and headed toward the parking garage. Victoria had apparently driven her own car to the airport, suggesting this was a planned romantic getaway rather than a coincidental meeting in a city where David happened to be conducting business. The hotel they selected was definitely not the kind of accommodation David's firm would have approved for business travel. The Fairmont Olympic was luxurious and expensive, with rates that would have required significant personal funds to supplement any legitimate business reimbursement. Rebecca watched from the lobby as David and Victoria checked in together, their body language and interaction with hotel staff making clear they were registering as a couple. Rebecca spent Tuesday evening in her own hotel room, documenting everything she'd observed and planning her next steps. The evidence was now overwhelming and undeniable. David wasn't just having an affair, he was living a complete double life that involved financial deception, emotional cruelty, and systematic lying about virtually every aspect of his professional and personal activities. Wednesday morning brought her final piece of evidence gathering. Rebecca positioned herself in the hotel restaurant where she could observe David and Victoria having breakfast together. Their conversation was animated and intimate, clearly focused on future planning rather than casual vacation activities.
She managed to position herself close enough to overhear portions of their discussion, which centered on Victoria's upcoming lease renewal and David's timeline for ending his marriage. They were planning to move in together within the next 6 months, with David handling the logistics of divorce in a way that would minimize financial impact on their shared resources. The casual nature of their planning was devastating. These weren't two people agonizing over difficult decisions or struggling with moral implications. They were simply coordinating logistics for a transition they both wanted, treating Rebecca's feelings and future as minor obstacles to be managed efficiently. Victoria's comment about being excited to finally live openly together particularly stung. She'd apparently been looking forward to the end of secrecy, eager to claim David publicly rather than continuing to share him with his wife. The anticipation in her voice suggested she viewed Rebecca as a temporary inconvenience rather than a real person whose life was being destroyed. Rebecca returned to Portland that evening with a complete understanding of her situation and a clear plan for how to proceed. The naive woman who had discovered her wedding ring in David's desk drawer was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was dealing with and what needed to be done. David's return home that night was perfectly orchestrated, complete with stories about successful client meetings and promising business developments. He brought Rebecca a small gift from the hotel gift shop, a souvenir that was supposed to demonstrate his thoughtfulness while traveling for work. The gesture that once would have seemed sweet now felt like an insult, a token offering designed to assuage any guilt about his deception. That night, as David slept peacefully beside her, Rebecca lay awake finalizing her strategy. She'd gathered enough evidence to prove his infidelity and financial deception in any divorce proceeding. She'd documented his systematic lying and emotional cruelty through months of communications with Victoria. She'd established a pattern of behavior that no reasonable person could dismiss as a momentary lapse in judgment. Most importantly, she'd developed a plan that would ensure David face consequences for his choices while protecting her own interests and future. The time for investigation was over. The time for strategic action had begun. Rebecca's transformation was complete. The trusting wife who had once baked muffins for her husband's supposed business meetings was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that respect must be demanded rather than assumed, that trust must be earned rather than given freely, and that some betrayals require swift and decisive justice. The game had changed, and Rebecca was ready to play by the new rules. David had spent months planning his exit from their marriage while maintaining the benefits of her trust and support. Now it was Rebecca's turn to plan, and she intended to ensure that his carefully constructed deception would crumble in ways he never anticipated. The week of investigation had revealed not just David's infidelity, but his fundamental lack of respect for her as a person. He'd viewed their marriage as a convenience to be exploited, rather than a partnership to be honored. He'd stolen from their shared resources, lied about his whereabouts, and made plans for a future that deliberately excluded her while continuing to benefit from his emotional and financial support. But Rebecca's strategic planning would ensure that David's moment of reckoning arrived sooner than he anticipated, and in ways that would make clear that his victims were not as powerless as he'd assumed. The woman who had once trusted blindly was about to demonstrate that when trust is betrayed, justice can be swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. Thursday evening arrived with Rebecca feeling calmer than she had in weeks. Her investigation was complete, her evidence was comprehensive, and her strategy was carefully planned. David returned from what he claimed was another late meeting at the office, but Rebecca now knew he'd actually spent the afternoon apartment hunting with Victoria, looking at places where they could live together once his divorce was finalized. She'd watched them tour a luxury condominium downtown, observed their excitement as they discussed furniture placement and hosting dinner parties. The realtor had clearly assumed they were a married couple shopping for their dream home, while Rebecca sat in her car across the street documenting their plans for a future built on the ruins of her marriage. David kissed her hello with his usual practiced affection, asking about her day while pouring himself a glass of wine. Everything about his demeanor suggested a man comfortable with his deception, secure in his belief that his wife remained blissfully unaware of his double life. He mentioned needing to work late again the following evening, another fiction that Rebecca knew actually meant dinner plans with Victoria at an expensive restaurant they'd apparently been frequenting for months. "Actually," Rebecca said, setting down the dinner she prepared, "I was hoping we could have a serious conversation tonight." Something in her tone made David pause with his wine glass halfway to his lips. For just a moment, his confident mask slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty that suggested some part of him had always feared this moment would come. "Of course," he said, recovering his composure. "What's on your mind?" Rebecca pulled out her phone and placed it on the dining table between them. The screen showed the photograph she'd taken of David and Victoria embracing outside the Metropolitan Grill, their body language unmistakably intimate and romantic. David stared at the image for several seconds, his face cycling through emotions that Rebecca cataloged with clinical detachment: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally, a cold assessment that suggested he was already planning his response strategy. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I took it," Rebecca replied, "last Friday night when you told me you were at a client dinner that turned out to be a singles mixer for young professionals." She swiped to the next photo, showing David purchasing jewelry for Victoria, then another, capturing their intimate lunch during what he'd claimed was a golf outing. Each image was a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed lies. "Rebecca, this isn't what it looks like," David began, but she cut him off with a raised hand.
"Please don't insult my intelligence with denials," she said. "I have hundreds of photos, recorded conversations, financial records, email correspondence, and documentation of your activities going back months. I know about Victoria. I know about your secret bank account. I know about the Napa Valley trip you booked with our savings. I know about your plans to move in together and your timeline for divorcing me." David's face went pale as Rebecca continued presenting evidence. She showed him printouts of his emails with Victoria, bank statements documenting his financial deception, and photographs from their Seattle getaway that proved his business trip story was entirely fabricated. "I followed you to Seattle," Rebecca said calmly. "I watched you meet Victoria at the airport. I documented your romantic weekend at the Fairmont Hotel. I heard you discussing your plans to end our marriage so you could live openly with her." The comprehensive nature of her evidence seemed to overwhelm David's ability to formulate responses. Each revelation closed off another avenue for denial or explanation, until he was left sitting across from his wife with the undeniable proof of his betrayal spread across their dining table. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since Tuesday morning, when I found my wedding ring hidden in your desk drawer," Rebecca replied. "The ring I thought I'd lost, that I was heartbroken about, that you helped we search for while knowing exactly where it was the entire time." David's attempt to reach for her hand was met with Rebecca pulling away, a gesture that seemed to drive home the reality of how completely he'd destroyed their relationship. "I can explain everything," he said desperately. "Victoria and it's complicated, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. Our marriage is still important to me." "Our marriage is a lie," Rebecca said flatly. "You've been systematically deceiving me about every aspect of your life. You've stolen from our joint accounts to finance your relationship with another woman. You've told her that I'm boring and clingy, that you're planning to leave me, that you have no intention of having children with me. You've erased me from your professional identity and presented yourself as single to hundreds of people." Each accusation hit David like a physical blow, and Rebecca could see him scrambling to find some way to minimize the damage or regain control of the narrative. "The things I said to Victoria, I was just venting frustration," he said. "All marriages go through difficult periods. I never meant any of it seriously." "You booked a vacation with her using our savings," Rebecca countered. "You opened a secret bank account. You've been planning to move in together. These aren't the actions of someone venting frustration. These are the actions of someone systematically dismantling his marriage while keeping his wife in the dark." David tried several more approaches. He claimed the relationship with Victoria was ending, that he'd realized his mistake and was planning to recommit to their marriage. He suggested couples counseling, promised to change, begged for another chance to prove his love and devotion. But Rebecca had heard his real feelings in those recorded conversations with Victoria. She'd seen his genuine happiness when he was with his girlfriend, contrasted with his cold calculations about managing his wife's expectations. There was no sincerity in his current pleading, only panic at having his carefully managed situation exposed.
Here's what's going to happen, Rebecca said, pulling out a folder she'd prepared. I've already consulted with a divorce attorney. These are preliminary papers that document your infidelity, financial deception, and emotional cruelty. You have two choices for how we proceed. David's face went even paler as he realized Rebecca wasn't interested in reconciliation or forgiveness. This wasn't a discussion about saving their marriage. This was a negotiation about how their marriage would end. You can agree to an uncontested divorce with the settlement terms I'm proposing, Rebecca continued, or I can file contested papers that will make your infidelity and financial deception part of the public record. Your colleagues, your clients, Victoria's colleagues, everyone in your professional network will know exactly who you are and what you've done. The threat of professional exposure seemed to terrify David more than the prospect of divorce itself. His reputation as a trustworthy attorney was essential to his career advancement, and public knowledge of his character flaws could destroy years of professional development. "What are your terms?" he asked quietly. Rebecca handed him the settlement proposal she'd crafted with her attorney's guidance. The document was comprehensive and strategic, designed to ensure David faced real consequences for his choices while protecting Rebecca's financial future. The terms were straightforward but devastating. David would keep his personal assets but forfeit any claim to Rebecca's retirement savings, investment accounts, or future earnings. He would repay the money he'd stolen from their joint accounts, including funds used for his secret relationship and the Seattle trip. He would cover all divorce-related legal fees and provide Rebecca with 12 months of health insurance coverage while she transitions to independent coverage. Most importantly, David would vacate their shared apartment within 72 hours, allowing Rebecca to remain in their home without the discomfort of continued cohabitation. His personal belongings could be collected during scheduled times when Rebecca wasn't present, eliminating any opportunity for manipulation or emotional appeals. "This is excessive," David protested after reading through the document. "You're essentially punishing me financially for a relationship that never threatened our marriage." "A relationship that never threatened our marriage?" Rebecca repeated incredulously. "You were planning to divorce me to be with her."
You stole thousands of dollars from our savings to finance your affair. You systematically lied to me about your whereabouts for months. In what universe does that not threaten a marriage? David's attempts to negotiate more favorable terms were met with calm but firm resistance from Rebecca. She'd anticipated his objections and prepared responses that demonstrated she wasn't interested in compromise or gradual resolution. "These terms are non-negotiable," she said. "You have until Sunday evening to decide whether you want an uncontested divorce with these terms or a contested divorce that will expose everything you've done to everyone you work with." The deadline was strategic, giving David enough time to consult with his own attorney while preventing him from developing elaborate counter-strategies or attempting to hide additional assets. Friday morning brought David's first attempt at manipulation. He left for work early but returned during his lunch break, apparently hoping to catch Rebecca in a more receptive mood. She was prepared for this approach, having anticipated that he would try multiple tactics to avoid the consequences of his choices. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, settling beside her on their couch as if nothing had changed between them. "Maybe we could work out a different arrangement, something that acknowledges my mistakes without being quite so punitive." Rebecca didn't move away from his proximity, recognizing that maintaining emotional distance would be more effective than dramatic gestures of rejection. "What kind of arrangement are you imagining?" she asked. "Well, the financial terms seem harsh, given that we built those savings together," David said, "and requiring me to move out immediately seems unnecessary if we're both committed to handling this maturely." His words revealed everything Rebecca needed to know about his mindset. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of his betrayal, David still viewed himself as a victim of unreasonable demands, rather than the architect of his own consequences. "Those savings were built together," Rebecca agreed, "which is why it's particularly cruel that you spent them on another woman without my knowledge or consent. You stole from our shared future to finance your affair. The financial terms aren't punishment, they're restitution for what you took."
David tried a different approach, suggesting that Rebecca's demands would harm both of them financially and professionally. He painted their situation as a mutual problem requiring cooperative solutions, rather than a betrayal requiring accountability. If I have to pay all these fees and move out immediately, it's going to strain my finances significantly, he said. That might affect my ability to maintain the kind of career advancement that benefits both of us in the long run. There is no both of us anymore, Rebecca replied. You ended that when you decided to build a secret life with another woman. Your financial situation and career advancement are no longer my concern. The conversation continued for another hour, with David cycling through various manipulation tactics that Rebecca recognized from her research on divorce psychology. He tried guilt, claiming he'd made mistakes but still loved her deeply. He tried fear, suggesting that divorce would harm her more than reconciliation. He tried bargaining, offering various compromises that would allow him to avoid the full consequences of his actions. None of these approaches worked because Rebecca had moved beyond the emotional vulnerabilities that make manipulation effective. She'd grieved the loss of her marriage during the weeks of investigation, processing her anger and hurt in private while building her strategic response. By the time she confronted David, she was operating from a position of clarity rather than emotional reactivity. Friday evening brought an unexpected development. Victoria called Rebecca directly, apparently unaware that David's wife now knew everything about their relationship. "Hi, this is Victoria from Coleman & Associates," the voice said when Rebecca answered her phone. "I think there might have been some confusion about David's weekend plans, and I wanted to make sure we're not double booking his time." The casual audacity of the call took Rebecca's breath away. Victoria was calling to coordinate David's schedule as if she were his secretary rather than his mistress, apparently comfortable discussing her affair with his wife directly. "There's no confusion about David's weekend plans," Rebecca replied calmly. "He'll be spending them packing his belongings to move out of our apartment." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Victoria found her voice again. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. "I know about your relationship," Rebecca said. "I know about Seattle, about your apartment hunting, about your plans to move in together. I know about everything, Victoria. David and I are getting divorced." Victoria's response revealed everything about her character and her role in David's deception. Instead of expressing remorse or acknowledging the harm caused by their affair, she immediately focused on protecting her own interests. "David told me his marriage was essentially over," Victoria said defensively. "He said you two were staying together for financial reasons, but that there was no emotional connection anymore. I never would have gotten involved if I thought I was breaking up a happy marriage." The lie was so transparent that Rebecca almost laughed. Victoria had read David's emails about planning to leave his boring wife. She'd encouraged him to minimize time at home and maximize their time together. She'd celebrated their future plans while knowing David was still married and living with Rebecca. "You've been reading his emails for months," Rebecca said. "You knew he was lying to me about your relationship. You knew he was using our joint savings to pay for your dates. You actively participated in deceiving me, so please don't pretend you thought his marriage was over." Victoria's next response revealed the depth of her entitlement and self-deception. "David is an adult who can make his own choices about his relationships," she said. "If he wasn't happy in his marriage, he had every right to seek fulfillment elsewhere." The lie was so transparent that Rebecca almost laughed. Victoria had read David's emails about planning to leave his boring wife. She'd encouraged him to minimize time at home and maximize their time together. She'd celebrated their future plans while knowing David was still married and living with Rebecca. "You've been reading his emails for months," Rebecca said. "You knew he was lying to me about your relationship. You knew he was using our joint savings to pay for your dates. You actively participated in deceiving me, so please don't pretend you thought his marriage was over." Victoria's next response revealed the depth of her entitlement and self-deception. "David is an adult who can make his own choices about his relationships," she said. "If he wasn't happy in his marriage, he had every right to seek fulfillment elsewhere." The lie was so transparent that Rebecca almost laughed. Victoria had read David's emails about planning to leave his boring wife. She'd encouraged him to minimize time at home and maximize their time together. She'd celebrated their future plans while knowing David was still married and living with Rebecca. "You've been reading his emails for months," Rebecca said. "You knew he was lying to me about your relationship. You knew he was using our joint savings to pay for your dates. You actively participated in deceiving me, so please don't pretend you thought his marriage was over. Victoria's next response revealed the depth of her entitlement and self-deception. David is an adult who can make his own choices about his relationships, she said. If he wasn't happy in his marriage, he had every right to seek fulfillment elsewhere.
I didn't force him to do anything. You're right, Rebecca agreed. David made choices, and now he's facing the consequences of those choices. You made choices too, Victoria. I wonder if your law firm's partners know that you've been involved in an affair with a married colleague, or if David's firm knows he's been misrepresenting his marital status to clients and colleagues. The threat of professional exposure clearly terrified Victoria as much as it had David. Her voice became higher and more strained as she tried to backtrack from her previous statements. "There's no need to involve our careers in this personal situation," she said quickly. "David and I are both professional adults who kept our relationship completely separate from our work responsibilities." "Except for the networking events where you presented yourselves as a couple," Rebecca countered. "The firm's social media posts showing you together at company functions. The professional contacts who know you as David's girlfriend. Your relationship wasn't nearly as separate from your careers as you'd like to believe." Victoria ended the call abruptly, but Rebecca knew the conversation had achieved its purpose. Both David and Victoria now understood that their actions had consequences extending beyond their personal desires, and that Rebecca was prepared to ensure those consequences were comprehensive and lasting. Saturday brought David's final attempt to avoid accountability. He arrived at their apartment with his own attorney, a colleague from his firm who apparently specialized in family law. Rebecca had anticipated this development and had her own attorney available by phone for consultation. "My client believes the proposed settlement terms are excessive and potentially vindictive," David's attorney began. "We'd like to negotiate more equitable arrangements that reflect the complexities of modern marriage and the reality that relationships sometimes evolve in unexpected directions." The lawyer's euphemistic language was clearly designed to minimize David's culpability while creating space for more favorable terms. Rebecca had been warned to expect this approach and was prepared with her response. "The settlement terms reflect documented financial theft, systematic deception, and emotional cruelty," Rebecca replied. "Your client stole thousands of dollars from joint accounts to finance his affair, lied about his whereabouts for months, and made plans to abandon his marriage while continuing to benefit from his wife's support. These aren't complexities of modern marriage, these are straightforward violations of basic marital obligations." David's attorney tried various legal strategies to reduce his client's financial obligations and extend the timeline for moving out of their shared apartment. He suggested that Rebecca's evidence might not be admissible in divorce proceedings, that her demands exceeded what courts typically awarded in similar cases, and that David's career could be unfairly damaged by rushed resolution. But Rebecca's attorney had prepared for these arguments, and her evidence was both comprehensive and legally sound. The photographs, financial records, and documented communications created an unassailable case for David's infidelity and deception. More importantly, Rebecca's proposed settlement terms were actually moderate compared to what she could demand through contested divorce proceedings. "Your client has committed adultery, financial fraud, and emotional abuse," Rebecca's attorney explained during the conference call. "In a contested divorce, the court could award my client significantly more than she's requesting, and the proceedings would create public records that could permanently damage your client's professional reputation. The current settlement offer is actually quite generous given the circumstances." The legal consultation lasted 3 hours, with David's attorney gradually realizing that his client's position was indefensible and that Rebecca's terms were the best outcome David could realistically expect. Saturday evening brought David's surrender. He signed the divorce papers without further negotiation, acknowledging in writing that his adultery and financial deception had caused the irretrievable breakdown of their marriage. The document included admissions that would protect Rebecca from any future attempts to contest the settlement or shift blame for their divorce. "I need you to know I never meant for things to happen this way," David said, as he prepared to leave their apartment for the final time. "When Victoria and I first met, I thought I could manage both relationships without anyone getting hurt."
"The problem with that thinking," Rebecca replied, "is that it assumes I don't matter enough to deserve honesty about my own life. You made decisions about my future without my knowledge or consent, using my trust and support to enable your betrayal." David's attempts to frame their situation as a tragic misunderstanding rather than a deliberate betrayal were met with the same calm refusal to accept his rewritten narrative that Rebecca had maintained throughout their confrontations. "I hope someday you can forgive me," he said, pausing at the door with his suitcases. "Forgiveness is for your benefit, not mine," Rebecca said. "I don't need to forgive you to move forward with my life. I just need you to face the consequences of your choices and stay out of my way while I build something better." David's departure felt less like an ending than a beginning. The apartment that had contained 3 years of lies and deception was finally free of the person who had contaminated it with his systematic betrayal. Rebecca spent the evening reclaiming spaces that had been tainted by David's presence, rearranging furniture and removing reminders of their shared life. Sunday brought the first of many consequences that would follow David and Victoria beyond their divorce proceedings. Rebecca had spent the weekend crafting carefully worded communications to key people in their professional networks, not to spread gossip or seek revenge, but to ensure that their colleagues understood the character of the people they were working with. Her first email went to David's law firm partners, documenting his misrepresentation of his marital status to clients and colleagues, his use of firm resources for personal relationships, and his financial deception that could reflect poorly on the firm's ethical standards. The message was professional and factual, focusing on behaviors that violated professional standards rather than personal grievances. The second communication went to Victoria's firm, detailing her participation in an affair with a married colleague and her use of professional networking events for personal romantic purposes. Rebecca included documentation showing how Victoria had encouraged David's deception and actively participated in plans to destroy his marriage. Both messages emphasized that Rebecca wasn't seeking professional sanctions against either individual, but felt obligated to ensure their employers understood the ethical standards their employees maintain in their personal lives. The implied threat was clear. Both David and Victoria's professional reputations would be permanently tainted by knowledge of their affair and the methods they'd used to conduct it. Monday morning brought swift responses from both law firms. David's partners requested an immediate meeting to discuss the allegations, while Victoria's firm launched an internal investigation into potential conflicts of interest and ethical violations. The professional consequences Rebecca had threatened were materializing faster than either David or Victoria had anticipated. By Tuesday, David was calling Rebecca in panic, begging her to retract her communications to their employers. His meeting with the firm partners had gone poorly, with serious questions raised about his judgment, ethics, and fitness for advancement within the organization. Victoria had been placed on administrative leave while her firm investigated potential violations of their professional conduct policies. "You're destroying our careers over a personal matter," David pleaded during their phone conversation. "This is vindictive and unnecessary. I'm ensuring that people who make professional decisions about you have accurate information about your character. Your employers have the right to know that you're capable of systematic deception, financial theft, and emotional manipulation."
These aren't personal flaws that only affect your marriage. These are character traits that could affect your clients, colleagues, and business partners. David's arguments that his personal life shouldn't affect his professional standing were undermined by the reality that his deception had extended into professional settings. He'd misrepresented his marital status to clients, used firm resources for personal relationships, and demonstrated a willingness to maintain elaborate lies over extended periods. Wednesday brought news that David's firm had decided not to promote him to partner as previously planned, citing concerns about his judgment and ethical standards. Victoria's firm had terminated her employment entirely, determining that her affair with a married colleague violated their conflict of interest policies and reflected poorly on their commitment to ethical business practices. The professional consequences were swift and devastating, but Rebecca felt no satisfaction in their suffering. She'd simply ensured that David and Victoria faced accountability for choices they'd made freely and repeatedly over many months. Thursday brought news that David's firm had decided not to promote him to partner as previously planned, citing concerns about his judgment and ethical standards.
Victoria's firm had terminated her employment entirely, determining that her affair with a married colleague violated their conflict of interest policies and reflected poorly on their commitment to ethical business practices. The professional consequences were swift and devastating, but Rebecca felt no satisfaction in their suffering. She'd simply ensured that David and Victoria faced accountability for choices they'd made freely and repeatedly over many months. Thursday marked 2 weeks since Rebecca had discovered her wedding ring in David's desk drawer, and she spent the afternoon meeting with a career counselor to discuss her own professional future. The marketing agency where she'd worked for 5 years had offered her a promotion that would have required relocating to their San Francisco office, an opportunity she'd declined because David's career was based in Portland. Now, with no husband to consider and a substantial divorce settlement providing financial security, Rebecca was free to pursue opportunities that aligned with her own goals and interests. The San Francisco position was still available, along with several other options she hadn't seriously considered while prioritizing David's advancement over her own. The career counselor helped Rebecca understand how much she'd sacrificed for a marriage that had never been real. She'd turned down jobs, postponed education, and limited her social connections to support a partner who'd been systematically betraying her trust while planning to abandon her for someone else. Friday brought Rebecca's final interaction with Victoria, who called to blame her for the professional consequences both she and David were facing. "You've destroyed 2 careers and ruined multiple lives over a relationship that was ending anyway," Victoria said angrily. "David was planning to divorce you. All you've accomplished is causing unnecessary pain and damage." "David was planning to divorce me after using me for financial support while he established his relationship with you," Rebecca corrected. "He was planning to steal from our savings, lie about his whereabouts, and abandon me without warning after I'd spent years supporting his career advancement. If that plan had succeeded, I would have been left with no financial security, no warning to prepare for independence, and years of my life wasted on someone who never valued my contributions." Victoria's anger revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. She'd viewed Rebecca as an obstacle to her happiness with David rather than a person deserving of honesty and respect. The professional consequences they were facing weren't vindictive punishments, but natural results of choices they'd made freely and repeatedly. "Professional success requires personal integrity," Rebecca continued. "If you and David had approached this situation honestly, respecting the commitments you'd made and the people you were affecting, none of these consequences would exist. You chose deception, theft, and emotional cruelty. These are the results of those choices." Victoria's final words revealed the depth of her entitlement and self-deception. "You're a bitter, vindictive woman who can't accept that your marriage was failing," she said. "David was never really yours, and now you've made sure he can't be mine either." "David was never yours either," Rebecca replied calmly. "He was using both of us for different purposes while being honest with neither. The difference is that I've chosen to build a life based on truth and self-respect, while you've chosen to build one based on deception and the destruction of other people's commitments." The following weeks brought a cascade of positive developments that Rebecca couldn't have imagined during the dark days of her investigation. The San Francisco job offer was renewed with improved terms, including relocation assistance and a signing bonus that reflected her experience and potential value to the organization. Her divorce settlement provided financial security that allowed her to pursue opportunities based on interest rather than necessity. The apartment she'd shared with David became a peaceful sanctuary where she could process her experiences and plan her future without the contamination of ongoing deception. Most surprisingly, Rebecca discovered that several of David's colleagues had harbored suspicions about his character but had never felt comfortable expressing them directly. His systematic misrepresentation of his marital status had created professional relationships built on false premises, and many of his colleagues felt relieved to finally understand why their interactions with him had seemed somehow inauthentic. Martha, the receptionist, who had tried to protect Rebecca from discovering David's double life, sent a heartfelt apology, explaining that she'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to address the situation without risking her own employment. Other colleagues reached out with similar messages, expressing support for Rebecca's decision to expose David's deception and admiration for the strategic way she'd handled the situation. Rebecca's story became a cautionary tale within their professional community, not because she'd sought revenge against an unfaithful husband, but because she'd demonstrated the importance of accountability and the consequences of systematic deception. Young attorneys used her approach as a model for how to handle personal crises with dignity and strategic thinking. 2 months after David's departure, Rebecca received news that he and Victoria had ended their relationship. The stress of professional consequences, financial difficulties from the divorce settlement, and the reality of being together without the excitement of secrecy had destroyed whatever connection they'd imagined they shared. David had been forced to take a position with a smaller firm at significantly reduced salary, while Victoria had relocated to another city to rebuild her career away from the professional damage their affair had caused. The future they'd planned together while destroying Rebecca's marriage had proven unsustainable when subjected to the honest scrutiny they'd worked so hard to avoid. Rebecca felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but she recognized the justice in their situation. They'd built their relationship on the destruction of other people's commitments and the violation of professional ethical standards. When those foundations proved unsustainable, their relationship collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. 6 months after discovering her wedding ring in David's desk drawer, Rebecca stood in her new San Francisco office, looking out at views of the bay that represented possibilities she'd never imagined while trapped in a marriage built on lies. The marketing campaign she was developing had attracted national attention, and her career was advancing faster than she'd ever thought possible. The woman who had once trusted blindly and baked muffins for a husband who was systematically betraying her trust while planning to abandon her for someone else was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that respect must be demanded rather than assumed, that trust must be earned through consistent actions rather than persuasive words, and that personal integrity was non-negotiable regardless of the temporary advantages that deception might provide. Rebecca's new life was built on foundations of truth, self-respect, and strategic thinking. She'd learned to verify rather than trust, to investigate rather than assume, and to protect her own interests while treating others with the honesty she expected in return. The wedding ring that had once symbolized a commitment based on mutual love and respect now sat in a small box in her closet, a reminder of the importance of paying attention to actions rather than words, of trusting evidence rather than explanations, and of recognizing that some betrayals are so fundamental that they require swift and comprehensive justice. Rebecca's story became a powerful reminder that victims of deception are not powerless, that systematic betrayal can be met with strategic accountability, and that the end of one life built on lies can become the beginning of another built on truth and self-determination. The consequences David and Victoria faced were not punishments imposed by a vindictive ex-wife, but natural results of choices they'd made freely and repeatedly over many months. Professional success requires personal integrity, Rebecca continued. If you and David had approached this situation honestly, respecting the commitments you'd made and the people you were affecting, none of these consequences would exist. You chose deception, theft, and emotional cruelty. These are the results of those choices. Victoria's final words revealed the depth of her entitlement and self-deception. "You're a bitter, vindictive woman who can't accept that your marriage was failing," she said. "David was never really yours, and now you've made sure he can't be mine either." "David was never yours either," Rebecca replied calmly. "He was using both of us for different purposes while being honest with neither. The difference is that I've chosen to build a life based on truth and self-respect, while you've chosen to build one based on deception and the destruction of other people's commitments." The following weeks brought a cascade of positive developments that Rebecca couldn't have imagined during the dark days of her investigation. The San Francisco job offer was renewed with improved terms, including relocation assistance and a signing bonus that reflected her experience and potential value to the organization. Her divorce settlement provided financial security that allowed her to pursue opportunities based on interest rather than necessity. The apartment she'd shared with David became a peaceful sanctuary where she could process her experiences and plan her future without the contamination of ongoing deception. Most surprisingly, Rebecca discovered that several of David's colleagues had harbored suspicions about his character, but had never felt comfortable expressing them directly. His systematic misrepresentation of his marital status had created professional relationships built on false premises, and many of his colleagues felt relieved to finally understand why their interactions with him had seemed somehow inauthentic. Martha, the receptionist, who had tried to protect Rebecca from discovering David's double life, sent a heartfelt apology, explaining that she'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to address the situation without risking her own employment. Other colleagues reached out with similar messages, expressing support for Rebecca's decision to expose David's deception and admiration for the strategic way she'd handled the situation. Rebecca's story became a cautionary tale within their professional community, not because
The difference was that this life belonged entirely to her, free from the contamination of other people's deceptions and the vulnerability that came from trusting without verification.
The wedding ring remained in its box, a symbol not of lost love, but of lessons learned and strength discovered. Rebecca had transformed from someone who accepted lies for the sake of peace into someone who demanded truth for the sake of dignity. The woman who had once baked muffins for a husband who was systematically betraying her had evolved into someone who understood that real love required honesty, that genuine partnerships demanded mutual respect, and that personal integrity was worth more than any relationship built on deception. Her story became a testament to the power of strategic thinking over emotional reactivity, of evidence over assumptions, and of self-respect over the desire to maintain comfortable illusions. Rebecca had learned that when trust is systematically betrayed, justice can be swift, comprehensive, and ultimately liberating for everyone involved. The consequences David and Victoria faced were not the result of vindictive action, but of strategic accountability that ensured their choices had real and lasting results. Their professional setbacks reflected the reality that personal integrity and professional success were inseparably connected, that systematic deception in one area of life inevitably affected others. Rebecca's triumph was complete not because she'd destroyed her enemies, but because she'd reclaimed her life from people who treated her dignity and future as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of selfish desires. She'd moved beyond the role of victim to become an architect of her own destiny, someone who understood that real power came not from trusting blindly, but from verifying carefully, not from forgiving automatically, but from demanding accountability consistently. The marketing campaigns she developed in her new role reflected this transformation, focusing on authentic connections, honest communication, and the importance of integrity in building lasting relationships. Her professional success became a platform for promoting the values she'd learned through her personal ordeal: that truth was more valuable than comfort, that respect was more important than peace, and that some betrayals required swift and comprehensive justice. As Rebecca looked toward a future built on foundations of honesty and self-determination, she understood that her story was really about transformation rather than revenge, about empowerment rather than destruction, about the journey from naive trust to strategic wisdom that some people must take to reclaim their lives from those who would exploit their goodness for selfish gain. The woman who had once discovered her wedding ring hidden in her husband's desk drawer had evolved into someone who would never again allow her life to be built on other people's lies, who understood that real love required honesty and that genuine partnerships demanded mutual respect and shared commitment to truth. Rebecca's victory was complete, comprehensive, and absolutely deserved. She'd faced systematic betrayal with strategic intelligence, emotional manipulation with clear boundaries, and attempts at guilt and intimidation with unwavering commitment to her own dignity and worth. 1 year after Rebecca Martinez first discovered her wedding ring hidden in David's desk drawer, she stood before a conference room filled with marketing executives, presenting a campaign that would revolutionize how companies approached authenticity in customer relationships. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who had lived unknowingly in a web of lies was now considered an expert on authentic communication and trust-building strategies. The woman presenting that morning bore little resemblance to the naive wife who had driven downtown to surprise her husband with homemade muffins. Rebecca's professional wardrobe was sharper, her posture more confident, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to trust her own judgment above all else. The transformation wasn't just external, it was fundamental, touching every aspect of how she approached relationships, career decisions, and life choices. Her San Francisco apartment reflected this evolution. Where her Portland home with David had been filled with couple photos and shared mementos, her new space was distinctly hers. Art she'd chosen, furniture that reflected her taste, books she wanted to read rather than titles that looked impressive on shared shelves. The absence of compromise in her living space felt liberating rather than lonely. Every object told a story of deliberate choice rather than diplomatic negotiation. The marketing campaign Rebecca was presenting that morning had grown out of her personal experience with deception and discovery. Her research had revealed that consumers increasingly valued authenticity from brands, but that most companies struggled to communicate genuine values rather than carefully crafted personas. Her approach focused on transparency, consistent messaging across all platforms, and the kind of vulnerability that builds real trust rather than manufactured connection. Authenticity can't be faked, Rebecca told the executives, clicking to a slide that showed consumer trust metrics. People have sophisticated radar for detecting when someone is performing rather than being genuine. The brands that succeed long-term are those willing to be honest about their limitations as well as their strengths. The presentation drew standing applause, but Rebecca recognized that her expertise came from painful personal experience rather than academic theory. She'd learned to detect deception because she'd been systematically deceived. She understood the value of transparency because she'd lived with its absence. Her professional success was built on lessons learned through personal devastation. After the presentation, Rebecca walked along San Francisco's waterfront, a routine she developed for processing complex emotions and strategic decisions. The bay stretched toward horizons that represented possibilities she was still discovering. The woman who had once planned her life around someone else's career trajectory now made decisions based entirely on her own goals and values. Her phone buzzed with a text from her attorney, providing an update on the final divorce proceedings. David had attempted one last negotiation, trying to reduce his financial obligations by claiming his reduced income made the original settlement unrealistic. The request had been denied, with the judge noting that David's career setbacks were direct consequences of choices he'd made freely and repeatedly. Rebecca felt no satisfaction in David's continued struggles, but she appreciated the confirmation that accountability was being maintained. Justice wasn't about punishment, it was about ensuring that actions had consequences and that victims weren't left to bear the cost of other people's poor choices. Victoria had apparently moved to Denver, where she'd found work with a smaller law firm at significantly reduced salary. Social media posts suggested she was struggling both personally, unable to rebuild the career momentum she'd sacrificed for her affair with David. Rebecca occasionally wondered if Victoria had learned anything from the experience, or if she still viewed herself as a victim of unreasonable consequences, rather than the architect of her own downfall. The professional consequences both David and Victoria faced had rippled through their legal community in ways Rebecca hadn't anticipated. Several young attorneys had reached out to thank her for exposing behavior they'd witnessed but hadn't known how to address. Others had shared similar stories of colleagues who maintained elaborate deceptions about their personal lives while expecting professional trust and advancement. Rebecca's approach to handling her situation had become something of a model within professional circles. Rather than pursuing emotional revenge or public humiliation, she'd focused on documentation, strategic action, and protecting her own interests while ensuring appropriate accountability. Law schools now used her case as an example of how personal ethics and professional standards were inseparably connected. Her new life in San Francisco had exceeded every expectation she dared to form. The marketing agency valued her insights on authentic communication, and her campaigns consistently outperformed competitors who relied on traditional manipulation tactics. Companies sought her consultation specifically because she understood how to build genuine trust rather than manufactured loyalty. More importantly, Rebecca had discovered aspects of herself that had been suppressed during her marriage. She'd joined a hiking group and found she loved the physical challenge and mental clarity that came from conquering difficult trails. She'd enrolled in a photography class and discovered a talent for capturing moments of genuine emotion and natural beauty. She'd learned to cook elaborate meals for herself without feeling selfish or wasteful. The social life she'd built in San Francisco was entirely her own choice. Friends were selected based on shared interests and compatible values rather than professional networking or couple-friendly dynamics. Rebecca had learned to enjoy her own company enough that social interactions were additions to her happiness rather than desperate attempts to avoid loneliness. Dating had been a complex challenge that Rebecca approached with the same strategic thinking she'd applied to her divorce proceedings. Her experience with David had taught her to pay attention to actions rather than words, to verify claims rather than accept them automatically, and to recognize that some red flags couldn't be explained away or overcome through patience and understanding. The men who approached her were often intimidated by her success and independence, qualities that had been suppressed during her marriage but now formed the foundation of her identity. She'd learned to view this intimidation as a useful filtering mechanism rather than a problem to be solved. Partners who couldn't appreciate her strength and autonomy weren't worth her time or emotional investment.
6 months earlier, Rebecca had met James, a freelance photographer who specialized in documentary work about social justice issues. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than desperate need or convenient timing. James appreciated Rebecca's strategic thinking and emotional strength, while she valued his artistic vision and commitment to meaningful work. Their relationship felt different from her marriage in fundamental ways. Conversations were honest rather than performative. Decisions were made collaboratively rather than diplomatically. Trust was built through consistent actions rather than assumed based on romantic feelings. Rebecca had learned that real love required genuine compatibility rather than just mutual attraction and good intentions. James knew Rebecca's story and respected the lessons she'd learned through her experience with David. He understood that her insistence on transparency and verification wasn't paranoia, but wisdom earned through painful experience. Their relationship moved forward at a pace that honored both their individual goals and their growing connection. The contrast between her current relationship and her marriage was stark. Where David had hidden aspects of his life and presented different versions of himself to different people, James was consistently authentic across all contexts. Where David had made unilateral decisions while pretending to consult Rebecca, James genuinely valued her input and perspective on decisions that affected their relationship. Most importantly, James supported Rebecca's independence and career advancement, rather than viewing them as threats to his own goals. He celebrated her professional successes, encouraged her to pursue challenging opportunities, and never suggested that her achievements should be moderated for the sake of relationship harmony. Rebecca's financial situation had stabilized in ways that provided security without excess. The divorce settlement had given her a foundation for independence, while her career advancement provided ongoing income that reflected her actual value in the marketplace. For the first time in her adult life, Rebecca's financial decisions were based entirely on her own priorities and goals. She'd purchased a small cabin in the mountains north of San Francisco, a retreat where she could escape city pressures and reconnect with herself. The cabin represented everything her marriage had lacked: space that belonged entirely to her, decorated according to her taste, filled with activities she enjoyed rather than compromises designed to accommodate someone else's preferences. Weekend retreats to the cabin had become essential to Rebecca's mental health and creative development. She'd written articles about authentic marketing strategies, developed photography skills that complemented her professional expertise, and simply enjoyed the luxury of making decisions based entirely on her own desires and needs. The woman who had once sought approval for everything from dinner choices to career decisions now trusted her own judgment completely. Rebecca had learned that independence wasn't selfish, but necessary, that boundaries weren't mean but protective, and that respect had to be demanded rather than hoped for. Her relationship with her family had evolved as well. Rebecca's parents had initially encouraged her to try harder to save her marriage, suggesting that David's infidelity might be overcome through counseling and forgiveness. But as the full extent of his deception became clear, they'd come to appreciate their daughter's strength and strategic thinking. Her younger sister had been particularly influenced by Rebecca's approach to the divorce. Maria had been struggling in her own relationship, with a boyfriend who frequently made commitments he didn't keep and promises he didn't honor. Watching Rebecca demand accountability and refuse to accept excuses had inspired Maria to raise her own standards and expectations. The ripple effects of Rebecca's transformation extended beyond her immediate family. Friends who had known her during her marriage commented on her increased confidence and clarity. Colleagues sought her advice on handling difficult personal situations because they'd observed how effectively she'd managed her own crisis. Rebecca had become an unintentional mentor to other women dealing with deception and betrayal in their relationships. Her approach of gathering evidence, developing strategy, and protecting one's own interests while ensuring appropriate consequences had proven effective for others facing similar challenges. The marketing agency where Rebecca worked had promoted her to director level, recognizing not just her campaign successes, but her leadership abilities and strategic thinking. Her team respected her because she led by example, demonstrated integrity in all her interactions, and created environments where authentic communication was valued over political maneuvering. Rebecca's professional reputation had grown beyond her agency. She spoke at conferences about authentic marketing, consulted with companies struggling to build genuine customer relationships, and wrote articles that combined marketing strategy with insights about human psychology and trust building. The expertise she'd developed through personal trauma had become a professional asset that differentiated her from competitors who relied on traditional manipulation tactics rather than genuine value creation. Rebecca understood that sustainable business relationships, like personal relationships, required honesty, consistency, and mutual respect.
As she reflected on the years since discovering her wedding ring in David's desk drawer, Rebecca recognized that her transformation had been more complete than she'd initially imagined possible. The naive woman who had trusted blindly and prioritized others' comfort over her own dignity was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept anything less than honesty and respect. The lessons learned through her divorce had become principles that guided every aspect of her life. Trust had to be earned through consistent actions rather than assumed based on promises or explanations. Respect had to be demanded rather than hoped for. Personal integrity was not negotiable, regardless of temporary advantages that deception might provide. Rebecca's story had become a testament to the possibility of transformation through crisis. The woman who had been systematically deceived and financially exploited had become someone who understood the value of strategic thinking, evidence-based decision-making, and the importance of protecting one's own interests while treating others with honesty and fairness. Her new life wasn't perfect. Challenges were addressed directly rather than ignored or accommodated. Relationships were built on mutual respect rather than desperate need or convenient timing. Professional decisions reflected her values and goals rather than someone else's expectations or limitations. The wedding ring that had once symbolized a commitment based on lies now served as a reminder of lessons learned and strength discovered. Rebecca had learned that love without verification was wishful thinking, that trust without evidence was naivety, and that some betrayals required swift and decisive action rather than patience and forgiveness. Standing on her apartment balcony that evening, looking out at a city full of possibilities she was still discovering, Rebecca felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her from victim to victor, from naive trust to strategic wisdom, from a life built on other people's lies to one constructed on her own truth and determination. The transformation was complete, comprehensive, and entirely deserved. Rebecca had faced systematic betrayal with strategic intelligence, emotional manipulation with clear boundaries, and attempts at guilt and intimidation with unwavering commitment to her own dignity and worth. The woman who had discovered her wedding ring hidden in her husband's desk drawer had evolved into someone who would never again allow her life to be built on other people's deceptions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.